Hello everyone and welcome to day 2 of New Blood Digital Festival 2021. My name's Marie, I am Foundation Manager at D&AD. Each of the festival days is exploring a topic focused on helping new graduates and those looking to make their start in the creative industries. And today's talk is focused on how to use humour in your creative work. And as such, I am delighted to shortly hand over to today's moderator, Craig Oldham, who is Creative Director and founder of the Office of Craig, who will be leading the conversation between Tatiana Jezierski, strategist at Mother London, Jessica Pettway, photographer and director at Scribble Scrabble Productions, and Oliver Knowles, co-creator of Led by Donkeys. The panel will be with you for around an hour, and there's plenty of opportunity to ask them questions via the chat function to the side. So please do make the most of that. And we'll save most of those questions for the end of the session. So without further ado, I would like to hand you over to Craig and the rest of the panel to introduce themselves.
Hello, everybody out there. I'm Craig Oldham. I'm a designer, I guess, by trade, generally messing around in the fields of graphic design. And I'm hosting a pretty amazing panel, as Marie has just told you about, with Oliver, Jessica and Tatiana, joining us to talk about humour in creative work and how we can use it. I can't promise it's going to be a funny talk. Who knows? You know, it's a bit like explaining the joke, isn't it? That's never funny. But we will hopefully have a bit of fun in doing this. So I'm just going to hand over to each of our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves. But before that, extra special thanks to Jessica for joining us so early in the morning in New York. Really appreciate it. So if you just want to give us a quick heads up at who you are, I'll then get us going with the first question and we can have a good chat. So do you want to start, Jessica?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jessica Pettway. I'm a New York-based photographer and director. I love incorporating humor into my work, just really bold, bright color palettes, just fun maximalist patterns and things like that. And I'm really excited to chat with you all today.
Great stuff. Thank you. Oliver, over to you, mate.
Great, thank you, Craig. Pleasure to be here. My name, Oliver, and I'm one of the co-creators of Led by Donkeys, which was the guerrilla billboard campaign that came to prominence a couple of years ago on the Brexit issue. And we started by putting a poster up on a billboard and it went nuclear. But pleased to be here today and share some experiences with you.
Last but certainly not least, Tatiana.
Hi, thanks, Craig. I'm Tatiana. I'm a strategist at Mother London, which is an independent creative agency that works with lots of big brands. The virtue of us being an independent agency has always been that we can kind of choose the stuff we want to work on and the kind of work we want to produce. So humour has been a huge part of our output and something that we like to sort of really push in terms of the creative work that comes through the doors. I'm excited to chat to you.
Great stuff. Right, let's get going then, I guess. I'll try and make these as easy and as kind of general as possible and not preamble like I'm doing at the moment. But I guess the thing that's interesting to me about humour is the way that people talk about it. People call it like, having a sense, as if it's something innate in kind of all of us. So I guess I wanted to ask you, each of you individually, what humour means to you and how you use it and how you articulate it in your work. Guess. And should we start with you, Oliver, just as you're first on my screen?
Yeah, sure, Craig. It's a difficult question, actually. Obviously, humour is a very subjective thing. And I think the other thing to reflect on it is that it changes through time. Something that you can find funny one year may not be funny to you a couple of years later because the context changes. So in a way, context is an important setting. And certainly on our project, that's something we've had to take a great deal of care with because we're working on current affairs. And when you're trying to read the room on current affairs, clearly, there are very many different viewpoints and takes on it. I think, the value of humour to me as a campaigner, and really my background is in campaigning. Before Led by Donkeys, I worked for Greenpeace. The value of humour for me is in cutting through. It's trying to land a more fundamental message. And that's why I think if you get humour right in your content, you begin to break down a barrier. and you can actually land what it is you want to say. And whether that's, in the case of Led by Donkeys, basically a political accountability message, or previously for Greenpeace, it's a message about protecting the environment. I worked a lot on ocean protection campaigns. Humour can get you a step forward in terms of landing that fundamental message. So it's a great tool, but as we are going to unpack, I think, over the next hour, it comes with some risks.
Unpack, definitely. Tatiana, you mentioned in your little intro there about humour being really important to what you do and what Mother does. I wondered if you might want to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think I've seen humour sort of described a lot as the idea of sort of bridging the gap between people. And I was actually chatting to one of the strategists at Mother about this talk, and he was talking about humour as sort of a way to get over a sort of chasm. And you want to commit enough to that sort of joke that you make the leap with whoever you're telling it to, but you don't want to make it too big because then you'll never get to the other side. And I think that idea of, closing a gap, reaching out to someone and communicating in that kind of common language is what makes humour so powerful in advertising and in life. The reason that it works so well, I think, when it comes to the kind of campaigns that we're working on at Mother, is that a lot of them are for big brands who take themselves and their products very seriously because it's their business. And I think what can be brilliant about humour when it comes to talking to real people is that it does kind of keep you honest in a way. It lets you sort of, I guess, puncture that bubble a little bit and talk to people in sort of more human, more sort of relatable terms about things that matter to them, but that they might not necessarily care about so much in their day-to-day.
Great stuff. Jessica, how about you? How do you use humour, and is it important to you in your work?
Humor is so important to my work. I feel like it's crucial, and it's what people usually want to collaborate with me for. I think I shoot a lot of products and food, and similar to what Tatiana was saying, it's kind of these everyday things that we're usually used to seeing. So it's fun to kind of show it in a new light. Like, what if we put a hat on this product? Why can't we? It's fun to kind of figure out the rules that you can break with humor to kind of promote either a product or a message. And I think it's just a fun way to connect with people. You can connect with people like in a really dramatic and emotional way, or you can do it with a laugh, but either way, it's still over a shared experience, and you're gonna get to the point of your project or your campaign.
Right, so I mean, you've all sort of mentioned that. Well, you've all mentioned there's obviously large overlaps between what you're saying, but you all mentioned sort of people in that, and naturally, I guess what we're all trying to do as communicators or working in communications and and in culture and in creativity is connect with people. Why do you think that humour is so important, but equally, why is it so different to say being quite rational, quite logical, which I guess is maybe the other side of this, the sort of the spectrum to that on the emotional scale? What is it that makes it so powerful, humour, in engaging people? If anybody wants to jump in, 2 feet, go for it.
Yes, definitely keep in touch would be great.
Well, they're going after you.
I think kind of going after humor, like being funny, is another way of being vulnerable. Like, I kind of see maybe 2 ends of it. Like I said, being really dramatic and emotional, or being funny. I think they're both just really vulnerable ways to describe or talk about a common experience. Like, you can make a joke about the subway, and a lot of people are gonna understand that that's a shared experience. So it's really special to be able to connect with people over something that you share, and that's what makes it funny. We all relate to something.
Oliver, you were going to chime in.
I was going to say something very similar, actually, and I agree with that point. I think humor makes you more amenable to a fundamental message, and whether you're advocating for a political campaign or a cause, or you're trying to establish a brand or push a product, whatever it is, humor allows you to open a gate that gives you space to land your core message, whether it's to buy a product or to buy into a political position. And I think of our work on Brexit, and where we worked in a political and social cultural environment that was highly polarized, still is. Actually, humour was a gate to be able to say, come in and look at this content. And that's your hope with it. If you get somebody to giggle, to laugh, to smile, that you're moving them into a space basically where they're engaged with it. They're going to be warmer to your core message, which of course for us is not really humour. Like we don't consider ourselves Led by Donkeys to be humorists or comedians. Like we are a political accountability project, but humour is the device that allows us to move closer to landing that core message, I think.
I think for me, the thing that's really exciting about humour versus perhaps other sort of emotional ways of connecting with an audience is that it's often more surprising. It does involve sort of pushing boundaries a lot, or being sort of irreverent, or finding unexpected ways of kind of dressing up an insight. And I think that's what makes it cut through more, makes it more memorable, is that it's relatively easy to spot an insight and play it back to someone as it is. You see sort of slice of life advertising all the time, and that's fine. It's well and good, and it suits certain briefs. But I think the power of humour is that it is sort of, you catch people off guard a little bit, and like Oliver said, that does sort of open up then them a bit more to the message that you're trying to land. And I think it does sort of convey upon the rest of what you're saying this sense of kind of both confidence and competence, because you sort of spotted this observational insight, and then you found a really creative, bold way to bring it to life. And I think those two traits kind of working together are brilliant for brands as they are for people. And you just I don't think you get that when you lose that kind of that humorous edge to the work or to the idea.
So we sort of said in different ways there, like, finding those shared experiences or finding those insights, to use your word there, Tatiana. Like, how do you identify those? How do you think that's the way in? What, using your creativity as your muscle, how do you know when you've landed the right shared experience or the right insight? And then, I guess, how do you know when you're going to deliver that successfully? Because delivery is a really big part of the joke. How do you sort of work all that through as a creative practice? Anybody?
I think, for me, starting from kind of a strategic point of view and then working with creators as they refine that, I think finding the right insight is a case of knowing kind of who you're speaking to, what it is that you want to get across them, getting those kind of that contextual knowledge. And then often the insights that feel like the most exciting and the easiest to play with in terms of humour are the really obvious ones. It's people looking at something and almost just telling it like it is in its simplest terms. Often that in itself is quite funny. And then it just becomes a case of working with sort of tone or analogy, or finding the right way to kind of get that across really easily. But then, you start thinking about branding and recognition, and people know that it's coming from you, which is the less fun bit. But I think it really is about knowing who it is you want to make laugh. And that doesn't mean that everything has to be super, super targeted, but that old sort of advertising adage of like, if you want to speak to anyone, you have to speak to someone. Having that kind of focus as your starting point, I think, is really helpful for identifying exactly where that sort of little bit of truth is that's going to spark a really funny sort of reframe or analogy or exaggeration of that will make people smile.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I think knowing who you're trying to make smile counts for a lot. When we started the Led by Donkeys campaign, we were putting up posters with politicians' quotes on them, about Brexit. On paper, this doesn't really work as an idea. It sounds really dry and flat, but actually in the delivery, so it's in the context as well, putting these posters up in the street had humorous value, because you were able to kind of compare the hyperbole and exaggeration of politicians' claims against the unfolding reality of Brexit, which of course in early 2019 perhaps still is, you could argue, is a kind of degree of craziness. So that there was humour in the context, but yes, knowing who you're trying to make smile counts for a lot. And clearly, there was a big constituency in the UK at that time who were ready to receive a message that mocked the Brexit leadership. And I guess, whether you're pushing a political cause or selling a product, having an idea of where you're going, who your audience is, counts for a great deal.
And to echo what you two are saying, I think I work in a similar way where most of my work is somehow targeted towards millennials. So it's like, what do we find familiar, or like what is nostalgic to us? What are the things that we find familiar that I can then break and make funny? Like, why can't I just put a ponytail on this orange? Maybe we all remember that little cartoon from back in the day. Yeah, I think it's just fun to find what's familiar and find a way to break that using humor. And I think knowing when it's gonna land or not is a similar muscle to just creativity in general. Like if you kind of keep working at it, you'll figure out like your groove and what will land and how do you make that land and what actually makes sense. I think it's something to kind of keep working like a muscle.
So would you say then that there's quite a lot of, I guess, emotion, like a gut instinct to humour, or do you think it is something that you can hone and channel and sort of get better at, or do you feel like if you're funny, you're going to do funny work?
I think it's a bit of both. I think there are definitely some people that are way more hilarious than others, but again, like no one comes out the womb knowing these things, where we are honing it. Some people take classes, some people will just sit and consume that type of media. I think it's a bit of both. You have an edge if it's something that's within you or something that you grew up around, but I think just like creativity and like being inspired, like it's a muscle that you can seek out and work towards.
Yeah, agree again. I mean, there are funny people, right? We all know them. We have funny people that we work with. We have funny people in our groups of friends, and they are people who have, instinctively funny. They're quick off the mark. They can put a sentence together quickly. They have confidence to use humor. But I agree. We can all use humor. Actually, many of us, most of us, perhaps, when we're thinking about an issue or current affairs or a politician or a product or a brand, we can all think humorous thoughts. I guess the hurdle you have to get over, especially in a professional environment, is having the confidence to deliver funny thoughts. And I think that's a real challenge for creatives working together. Actually, for many people, and perhaps even more than we think, putting any kind of contribution forward in a big team meeting is tough. It takes a moment. You have to gather your thoughts. You want your point to land. If you then layer into that needing to be funny, like actually there's a really big barrier to making a contribution, and it freezes a lot of people out, and it leaves the kind of floor for the people who you tend to think are funny. They take that space. So actually I think the trick for agencies and groups, campaigning organizations, in creating funny content is to think really carefully about creating environments and processes that allow everybody to contribute, that allow you to gather funny thoughts and ideas from everybody, because sometimes it's the people you wouldn't normally think are funny, or the quieter people, who capture the idea that is the essence of humor in the piece, and that you need to make sure you're capturing that.
I think there's also, just building on that, there's so many different types of humor. So like it is essentially a huge toolkit of different ways to sort of make someone smile or make a situation feel more lighthearted, because some people are really quick and can come back and forth with these sort of little repartees that make you laugh in the pub. Some people are like brilliantly sort of different in the way that they think and can come up with these amazing analogies and almost like worlds of how you bring things to life. So I think things like the Cadbury gorilla, someone's just like, oh, joy to me is a gorilla playing the drum, and that's not necessarily something you would think of if your type of funny person is lots of one-liners. It's a very different kind of play, I guess. So I think being able to sort of try all of those different hats on and then get a sense for which one feels most appropriate for a specific situation or specific brief is the way to sort of develop those instincts and hone them over time. And I think it's the same particularly if you're working on one brand for a long time. Something like KFC used to be much more sort of banter, laddish kind of tone of humour, sense of humour, and that's been refined over time to something that feels more sort of irreverent and roguish, and that has been refined through the work and through making different campaigns and trying different tones of voice in places like social media. And over time you get that feedback from consumers, from the team working on it, from the clients, that just helps to really sort of distill what that is, so it does become something that is much more instinctive to creative because they've had the time to kind of play around with it and test the waters a little bit.
Just picking up on what you were saying there, the Cadbury's gorilla, I guess that is quite an interesting example, really. I'm thinking about that ad, and if you don't know it, for anybody out there watching, just Google it. You can't really escape it on the internet. But the humour in that, I think for me, in my understanding of humour, there seems to be quite I would say, a misconception that it's instant, that it's instantaneous, that if it's funny straight away. And that isn't always the case. Like you're saying, it's a toolbox. And that gorilla, it's not just, oh, it's a gorilla playing the drums. It's actually the way it's shot, the kind of mannerisms, the sort of slow breathing, the slow motion, and all that build up before he actually plays the drums. Is actually that does help that become funny. There's that is almost the craft of it. You know, how do you sort of, again, how do you gauge that? Is there a point where you think that'd be funny and then it stops being funny whilst you work on it, do you think? Do you know how much exposure to the joke do you need to make something like that?
It's a really interesting question. I think in terms of, I mean, it's interesting just thinking about actually when it comes to an ad, a lot of it isn't the kind of instantaneous funny that you get in conversation, and you are basically being like, this joke is going to be laboured for a good 20 seconds, and will it stay funny? And will it stay funny the third or fourth time someone watches it? They might not be laughing out loud each time, but hopefully they're not sort of rolling their eyes and changing the channel. And I think really, if you get sick of it as you're crafting it and start that this isn't very funny, that's not a good sign, because you are hoping that someone is going to interact with it several times in the real world. I think that's why it's useful to have a team of clients, strategists, mothers, which is what we call account handlers, and creatives and producers all around it, and then bringing in people for treatment stage. You've got sort of a little mini focus group there, and lots of different takes on it to just help make sure that it is feeling fresh and like it makes sense to everyone still, and you're not, like you say, just going into kind of tunnel vision on the project and finding ridiculous things funny just because you've been staring at them for long enough.
It's funny.
Oh, sorry, Ollie.
Just a quick point. I was going to say, some observations for my own, some different parts of my working life, Greenpeace versus Led by Donkeys. I mean, having spent, nearly 20 years working for Greenpeace, I found it significantly harder there to generate content with humour, because basically, it passes through so many different committees. And it'd be interesting to hear from other panelists on their experiences on this. But generally, my take is that committees round down humour, because the more eyes that are on it, effectively, so many different subjective senses of humour are brought to bear on it. What we found with Led by Donkeys is this sort of sense of liberation. There are only 4 of us, and we tend to find that funny ideas actually get rounded up because it's that small group. That comes with some risks, more of which perhaps later in the conversation, and how to manage those. But I have a sense that small groups, certainly my experience, interested to hear others, small groups can land funnier ideas and they don't get rounded down. But it'd be interesting to hear from others about how funny ideas move through your different creative processes.
Sorry, Jessica, do you want to pick up on that, or would you like me to fire one at you?
Well, I think I kind of agree. I think by the time the project gets to me as a photographer, I can kind of sense that it's been through so many hands and different wavelengths, and I'll get different versions of decks where like, oh, we could have gone for that, but like, let's like scale it in, scale it back, and like be a bit more safe. I think it is like what you said, it has to do with risk and also just the collaborative environment. I feel like going after humor or like telling a joke is the same level of vulnerability as sharing something intimate or like connecting with people on something that's maybe a little more serious. I think it's a similar level of vulnerability, because what if it doesn't land? That's how embarrassing. And then also the campaign fails, or just with any creative team, I think just room to throw ideas out there and grow together is great for humor as well.
Apart from me to sort of explain your process at all, Jessica, obviously with the creative being in the room and all, but you know, I'm just picking up on what you said beforehand about sort of trying. It felt to me like your process is quite organic, quite, you're in the room, let's try a hat, let's stick a ponytail on it, you know. In that environment, do you feel like you have to, do you know that before you go in the room? Do you know that this is going to be quite a collaborative process? And or equally, do you feel like this is going to be one of those jobs where I can't really make people laugh or engage with them because they're all pretty square or whatever? How do you gauge that, and how do you use your kind of experience and confidence to be vulnerable in those kind of situations, just to use your words?
I think it depends on the project. Like you said, reading the room, like in the pre-pro and all the decks beforehand, how much room do we have to play? Can we, for example, get maybe some extra props that are like out of left field and just throw them in? And then other projects are a little more prescriptive, like, no, we are putting this ponytail in this spot. So I think I just play it by ear and how the project is going. Sometimes I can be really hands-on with the art direction, and sometimes it's really prescriptive and I execute.
Great stuff. So I guess let's get talking about risks then, the risks of humour. Should be a fun bit. But you know, because I guess in the world we live in today, some would describe it as volatile, some would maybe describe it as too sensitive. How do we navigate risks? I guess from a client point of view, how do we get humour through that in that kind of environment? I guess that's one place to start, and then we can go from there. Anybody want to jump in? I'm going to throw you in, Oliver. You mentioned it before.
Yeah, let me jump in. I mean, look, we've made some mistakes, I should say, as led by donkeys. Working in current affairs in a fast-moving kind of news environment, we're often building content really quickly. From idea to delivery, it can be 4 or 5 days. Sometimes longer, but it can be a really quick turnaround. I'll give you an example. So we were working on a set of posters that parodied the Brexit Party at the European elections in 2019, and the Brexit Party didn't have a manifesto, so we decided to create one for them by using published quotes from various of their better-known candidates and MEPs. So we had one from Ann Widdecombe, who's a very well-known politician in the UK, really bigoted. And we put on a quote onto a poster that was basically Ann Widdecombe, and it was homophobic. It was her slamming homosexuality. What we thought we had was a funny poster that really ridiculed Ann Widdecombe for having this view, and we released the poster. And what happened very quickly is that we got just huge amounts of feedback saying this poster is wrong, it's out of context. Without more context, it just looks like you've put this piece of homophobic speech up on the wall. And of course, to us in our bubble, it worked, it was funny, it was part of a wider campaign. On its own, on a billboard, it didn't work. And I have to say, we moved very quickly to bring it down. It was a mistake. We covered it up, and we sort of published a short statement apologizing for it. But that for me is that, it was a we led by donkeys now have the Ann Widdecombe test. Have we spoken to other people about this? Have we stepped outside our bubble? And I think that is one of the dangers with humour, and particularly perhaps working in a small group. You can build ideas and end up delivering ideas very quickly that you haven't kind of road tested with the right people. And obviously in this case, when you're trying to build content that you think is advocating for people but actually ends up hurting them or making them feel more vulnerable, you've made a mistake. So there are risks, and I think the lesson for me there was, get out there and talk to more people, test with different audience groups to see how it's going to land.
Tatiana, how do you sort of sell in the joke, as it were?
I think for us, for me specifically in a team, like a lot of it is the sort of strategic sell, because we very rarely get briefs that are like, can we have a funny ad? Like, that's it, that's all we ask of you. And if we did, it would be quite a crap brief, because where do you begin? But I think a lot of the sort of the selling of any idea will rely on talking someone through the rationale and the process of how you got to it, sort of, I guess, the audience insights, etc., and making sure that you are still making an advert, like it still has a business function and there's still a message that they will want to land. And I think being able to sort of show that that remains the kind of the North Star of the creative idea is really important. And I think that is what often puts clients off, is the fear that, as I said, they want to be serious about their product and their brand, and joking takes away from that. And actually maybe making a joke seems like they have nothing to say, or they're avoiding sort of having to sort of answer to something or say something substantial about what they do. So a lot of our job is reassuring them and sort of almost joining the dots for them to be like, this is still going to not just make people laugh, but make them think differently about the brand. And I think that the big one for us, which we talk about a lot because we like it and people did too, is the KFC response to them running out of chicken. Because when we first showed that to the clients, we literally had sketched FCK on a piece of paper and been like, what about this? And the response from the client was, you want me to put a swear word on my logo bucket? Like, really? And there was a big thing of then being like, okay, so like, why is this the right thing to do? Because actually it was a really serious situation, because the business was at risk. It was frustrating for customers, and it was really difficult for team members who were on the front lines having to deal with frustrated customers. So there was a lot that was sort of very sensitive and quite serious about it. But at the same time, we were a chicken shop that didn't have any chicken, and people were calling the police and their local MPs to complain about it. So I think that finding the balance there between being able to be like, a bit of humour is good, it punctures the tension, and it allows us to hold our hands up and say we've done something wrong. But the sub-copy in that ad is all, we really appreciate the team members who are hard at work trying to get things back on track. We appreciate the patience of customers who are coming back time and time again and bearing with us while we don't have everything you need. So I think that had a real sort of sense of rationale at every step for, why are we doing this? Are we getting the balance right between the thing that has to be said and the way that we want to say it? And that saw huge returns. I think that again has helped us to then continue to have those kinds of conversations with that specific client.
Yeah, and I guess that's a really good example of, it's in that context, it's a relative risk to take for them as as you say, it's a serious situation for their business, but equally they've still got to engage with people and can not hold hands up, but be honest about the situation they're in. But I'm thinking about other contexts out there and other things that happen, other scenarios. Is there a line, do you think? Is there an area or a subject matter or a thing that you would never ever joke about? Or do you think everything is about just finding the right point and the right entry, and actually something really kind of taboo or really kind of solemn maybe is still a place where there is a place for humour in there if it's the right bit, maybe?
I think it's always a balance, because I think essentially, if we're talking about humour as being sort of an insight and sort of examining a truth and making sort of light of that, I think there's always a question of, how do you subvert it in a way that is a little bit uncomfortable enough to get the laugh, but not so much that it becomes kind of actually threatening. I think there's a thing that talks about humour as kind of benign violation, and if it's too benign, it's not funny, and if it's too violating, it's also not funny, because you've sort of caused genuine hurt and upset. So I think that question of looking at the truth of what you're trying to make light of and going, actually, is that sort of distant enough, and how great is the pain? Because if you get too close to sort of people's real difficult and traumatic experiences, then the risk is higher that you will offend them. So I think empathy is always the key thing in humour, judging that right, and making sure that you are on the right side of the line. Because I think, you look at things like I May Destroy You is a comedy series about an incredibly serious issue. So I would never say that the two are completely mutually exclusive, but it is a real sort of judgment call of looking at, I guess, whether there is enough distance between the pain and the joke for it to actually be funny and not to be bullying or mocking.
Yeah. And I think we all talked a lot about like shared experience. I think that's maybe the root of it. And I think it comes back to the things that we learned in, say, like preschool or kindergarten, like you laugh with people, not at them. And so I think that's just with that shared experience, or like you catch more flies with honey, like don't yuck people's yum. I think there are a lot of basic things that we can kind of keep in mind when we're crafting these jokes or these moments that can kind of be like a really helpful guiding light.
Yeah, a little take on that. I mean, it's important, isn't it? I think so. Who are you advocating for? Like who in which direction are you punching? I mean, I build political campaigns or cause-related campaigns. It's not for a product, but that's what we keep in sight. And what is the point which we're trying to land? And an example of this, we're currently in a context in the UK where almost certainly there have been tens of thousands of additional deaths from COVID as a result of bad decisions made by the government. Now, we are still finding a way to release content into that as led by donkeys, which I would say is on first take is humorous, at least we hope it is. For example, last week we put out a huge 98-sheet poster with which was a parody of the government's, if one person breaks the rules, we all suffer. And we put that up next to a huge photograph of Matt Hancock in the now infamous clinch with his aide, breaking the rules basically. But the point there is, so you're operating in a delicate situation, but using humor. I think it works because the fundamental point is that you're advocating, you're highlighting the rank hypocrisy, and actually you're advocating for people who suffered because rules were broken, first by Cummings and then by Hancock. So I think context is important for us. It's punching up, not down. It's taking care to look at where you're landing your work, and I think if you're doing that, then there are very few things that are off limits. I mean, we could all sit around and think about some issues which perhaps you wouldn't want to go to and treat with humor, but I would I'd be more inclined not to kind of put stuff off limits and work around using principles like are you making sure that you're punching up, not down? Are you trying to hold to account the people who had power and responsibility rather than the people who didn't?
So I guess, so what you're saying there is within the context of your work as led by donkeys, almost nothing's off limits, and humor is a really great kind of, I guess, crowbar into these things.
I think so. I mean, like I said before, we don't consider ourselves to be humorists or comedians. I mean, we're political campaigners. At the core of the project, it's political accountability. But certainly we recognise that humour is a great vehicle to use sometimes. It can really help, and particularly in political, cultural, social contexts where there is great polarisation. And Brexit was a great example of that. But I would argue that social media is making more issues polarised. It does polarise us. And therefore content which is able to kind of break through that polarization, which can put you in and reach new minds, is all important, because so often political, cultural, social solutions to problems sit somewhere in the middle. We find resolution through compromise, and yet we're being driven away from compromise. We're being driven to poles by social media.
You mentioned social media there. I was just going to start to sort of open up the discussion about actual, application, where these things go. We talked a lot about, the ideas and using humor as a way of communicating, but how do you all individually figure out what's the right delivery mechanism for it? How do you know it's a tweet versus a poster versus a shot versus a film versus an ad? How do you apply this kind of humor Or is it always, do you feel you work the other way around, where you feel this is the medium, how do we be funny within that? Does anybody want to tackle that one first? The medium.
In that way, usually my projects are, we're using this medium, how do we push it to its limits in any way possible, like visually or with humor, with color. Maybe we're shooting something that only needs 2 seconds and it's gonna loop, or maybe it's a little bit longer. Yeah, we tend to, I guess, reverse engineer in that way. It's usually pretty prescriptive.
I guess that in itself, though, opens up quite a lot of opportunity when you know where the edges are and you know what you kind of defines what you can do within that. Do you find that quite useful sometimes?
Yeah, that's definitely useful to just not have to have no boundaries. I think people always say is super hard. So it's nice to have some sort of guidance. Okay, this is what we're going after.
How about you, Tatiana? How the KFC ad, for example, how did you know that was going to be a print ad for, if
I mean, I think
else, but
that one specifically, I think, lent itself to print partly because we needed to do very quick turnaround broadcasts of being we need to put something in the metro in the next couple of days, drove that choice a little bit, or at least sort of gave people a space to start thinking of what the ideas might be sort of with that format in mind. I think more generally what we always try and do is get to an idea that could live anywhere, and the way that then shows up in different channels, the same way that you'd always want the TV to work, the idea to work well, sort of in a tailored way for TV or for social or for print or for out of home. The same is true of any comedy to it as well. So to use a different KFC example, the campaign that was called Chicken Town, that was all around the idea that KFC's chicken is so iconic that it has spawned all these sort of imitation chicken shops across the British High Street. And that's great, but none of them live up to the great taste of KFC. So it was all about imitation being the sincerest form of flattery to establish KFC as the sort of original and best. And in TV, that was this sort of very Godfather-esque, slightly hyperbolic Colonel, cruising the streets of the UK in a vintage red car while everyone sort of looked on in awe as he sort of passed by. In print and on social, we wanted something that felt a little bit more sort of, immediate, something that would work static for print, and I guess a bit more sort of visual or typographical. So that one was all playing with the idea of, AFC, BFC, CFC, taking inspiration from all of the chicken restaurants who have taken their inspiration from KFC. And it's the same joke. We're still saying there's all these people out there who want to be as good as us, but there's two sort of different ways of executing it which suit the channel in terms of, I guess, what kind of creative works powerfully there, but also the kind of humour that sits best.
And Oliver, you led by donkeys and your little gang there, you started with a medium in mind, didn't you? And now it's, sort of sprawling, very cross-disciplinary in lots of different fields. Was that a conscious thing?
To be honest with you, when we put the first billboard up in North London in January 2019, there was no plan other than to put up a couple more billboards, and we were doing it simply because it was personal cathartic release from the chaos of Brexit. So in a sense, everything that came after that has been sort of organic, and we've just been feeling our way with it. But Led by Donkeys, yes, now has certainly become is a bigger project. We're running it as a political accountability project on a range of different issues. We've done lots over the last year on Johnson's handling of COVID. I guess where we start though is to, we don't start with, how do we make something funny? We start with a target, or a politician, or an idea that we want, something we want to put into the main frame the political discourse, or a politician that we want to hold to account. To that end, yes, we have a range of tools that we consider using. We started with tweets. More recently, we've been making some sort of longer, more sort of journalistic films. But often the humour comes from where we take them. So, for example, we put together a well-researched 10-minute film on Johnson's handling of coronavirus. but we projected it onto Barnard Castle, which was the site of Dominic Cummings' supposed eye test. Now, in doing that, I guess what we play with is a sort of the movement between analog campaigning and digital. So I think it's one thing to make this film and stick it on your Twitter feed, but to make the film, project it, create it as a piece of sort of analog content in the real world, and then bring it back to social media and have it really fly, is really the mainstay of what Led by Donkeys does. And if we can find a way to make that humorous, then that really helps the content fly. I mean, another great one was, Dominic Raab, who you remember when he was Brexit secretary, said he didn't understand the importance of the trade route between Dover and Calais in France. That's a funny quote, but if you put that billboard up in Dover, you kind of weaponize it. It becomes even more funny. So for us, a lot of the humor comes from context. Where are we putting this to tell more of a story?
So just looking at the clock, but thanks for all that chat. This certainly stirred up a bit of debate in the Q&As and stuff. So I'm just going to dive into a couple of questions, but one of them is quite relative to what we're just talking about, which is, are there certain platforms where humorous content works better? And are there platforms that are not suitable for humor? So, I guess, is Twitter for funny people and Instagram not? Anybody want to dive in on that?
I think Twitter and TikTok lends itself to humor more, just because I guess something with the algorithm, things go viral or like can reach people more and just really circulate. And it feels like there's more of a collective visual and audio language happening on there that people can kind of make memes out of and share. Yeah, definitely those two for sure.
I agree with that. I think that's spot on. There's something about TikTok and Twitter. It's sort of shorter content. You can really get something punchy, and it works if it's 10 seconds or it works if it's 30 seconds. Somehow that doesn't quite translate to Facebook. I mean, we do put funny content on Facebook, and it does well, but it doesn't quite resonate in the same way as TikTok and Twitter. I have to say, we find the Instagram audience is quite enthusiastic for funny content. It seems to work well there, but Facebook certainly less so.
I guess what's interesting about Twitter and TikTok, at least I think, is that you kind of have it feels like more of a forum. And the same way that, laughter is funnier when you have someone else to laugh with, I guess with those things, people do pick up stuff and run with it really fast. And you get this sense of like, it's trending. There's lots of people finding this funny and jumping in and putting their stamp on it. I think that can really help the joke to fly and to kind of evolve and keep evolving and keep making people laugh. Whereas Instagram is a much more curated space. It doesn't necessarily feel funny. It feels kind of aspirational and educational, but I think it's probably a different kind of humor that lives there, where you're still sort of almost getting maybe a knowing smile rather than a laugh out loud.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, there's the other thing with Twitter as well, of course, is you can add Twitter handles. So if you're tweeting out, you've got content about a politician, you can add them into the conversation. So there's a certain, thrill, I think, in running out a piece of content that's sort of then bouncing, back into a politician's inbox. And I suppose that that's true of discourse or conversations around brands or companies as well. I think Twitter lends itself well to that. People enjoy that.
There's lots of questions coming in, so thanks for everybody who's pinging them over. But I'm just going to segue into another one, which is kind of similar, because we've been talking all there about social media, relatively recent kind of platforms and technologies, but do we feel that has made everything a little bit more funnier and a little bit more lighthearted? Is it easier to be funny now or harder? Tough one, that, yeah. I saw you breathing in there.
I think it's maybe both, like easier as in you have access to share it with however many millions of people, but maybe that makes it harder because, again, you're being vulnerable. Like if that joke or whatever concept doesn't land, the stakes are higher because more people can see it.
Yeah, I agree. But it's more public. It's more of a public stage. So if you're heckled, other people hear it.
Yeah.
And I guess it does require a certain amount more sort of flexibility, I think, because if you're talking about, there's advertising's been funny for decades. Like you get sort of very funny TV and print ads going back years and years and years. I think perhaps now the context that we've talked about so much is changing so rapidly that something that was funny quite recently could date really quickly, or situations change around and it suddenly appears really misjudged. So I think it's not so much that things have become more or less funny, but I think there maybe needs to be a bit more flexibility in then how you address a joke gone wrong, or how you interact with people who aren't finding it funny. That's there's a more sort of serious component which is built into it, because as we've talked about a lot, like humour shouldn't be about making anyone feel terrible about themselves. They're definitely not punching down. I think there's an element of how do you respond when that happens, and before you probably wouldn't have seen that response, and now you do, which is scarier, but also, as we've learned a lot over the past couple of years, like those are all learning opportunities and chances to kind of make amends, rather than have jokes that have gone badly sit in people's living rooms, and it never gets fed back to anyone that is not the right humour, or it hasn't sort of served the purpose that they thought it would.
Any thoughts on that, Oliver? Or
yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult one to call. Has it made it easier to deliver humour? I'm not sure. I mean, maybe in some ways, like there's more to riff off. If you're living on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, there's content to play with, and of course, constantly, you have the influx of new memes, or that you can use and riff on. I think if you're in the super responsive space, as we are sometimes, that can give you lots of room to move quickly and grow ideas. But whether it's fundamentally easier to land a funny concept, I don't know that that's changed very much. And as it's been said, there's been very funny advertising and funny campaigns for many years.
It's funny. I agree with you when you're talking about actually there's a lot more to riff off. It's kind of more competitive, because so many, like, everyone's a comedian and everyone's got a sort of mini platform to broadcast their comedy from. And we had a discussion at the end of last year about like creativity in 2020, and everyone was kind of like, memes are the winners. Like, all these people who are finding sort of humour in the mundanity of lockdown and sort of firing CrossFit memes to each other, like that's where a lot of the humour came from last year, was from people being creative about how they viewed their situation. And I think that was the big challenge for brands. Once you've made a decision that you didn't need to play it sort of super safe and be really sentimental, it was just kind of like, how do we be funnier than everyone else?
It's true. It's a crowded marketplace, isn't it? It's difficult. I mean, as political campaigners, the memes of kind of this you, where you pull up something that contradicts a statement, is a godsend, as is for Brexit, how it started, how it's going. But it's a crowded marketplace, and there are some very funny, witty people out there who aren't campaigners or brand creatives who do very well, and you're competing with them as well in that marketplace, of course.
We've probably just got time for one more. And I think, sorry, Jessica, but I'm going to zoom in on you at this point. The word that you've mentioned quite a lot, which has really resonated with me, is vulnerable, and being vulnerable in front of these kinds of situations with humour. I just wondered, starting with yourself, like, have you got any kind of advice for people, sort of sat watching this, who might be less confident than sort of others, how they can build that, how they can use humour as a tool, and how they can keep their confidence up to be vulnerable with people about their ideas, whether they contain humour or not, I guess? I wonder if you had any advice for people.
Yeah, well, I would say just continue to work that muscle. We've mentioned having these environments that are just conducive to just exploring and trying things out. Maybe you don't put your first ideas on social. Maybe you have a group of friends or colleagues that you can trust and kind of run ideas by, or just making sure you have people in your circle with different experiences. There's one person hasn't experienced everything. Like, you're not going to know how someone else might take something. So it's nice to just have a diverse group of people around you to just give you some of that insight. And I think just being disciplined and working that muscle. It's kind of the same way that I would talk about inspiration. It's not a passive thing that you just let come to you. You have to keep working at it or finding inspiration. Maybe you watch funny movies. Maybe you're on a specific section of Twitter or TikTok. Like, why are these landing? What's so funny about this? I think just really going after that specific muscle and just keep being vulnerable with it, and things will start to land.
That's really great. Thank you, Jessica. I'll just let our other two panelists have another, if there's any quick advice you might have to share before I hand back over to Marie.
Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, I would say, look, never create a meeting that's called, how do we make some funny content for X? That is where you immediately divide the room into people who are confident using humour, and you lose everybody else. That's a big no-no. Look, I would say, we have our best ideas when we're away from Zoom, or we're away from a work environment. Take your team out for the afternoon, spend the afternoon in the gallery, do everything you can to create an environment which is relaxed and fun, because that's when you start to riff with ideas. And you create a space where everybody is kind of free to input, and I think that's where you really capture the fun stuff.
I agree. I think that there's sort of starting points that you can play with. Just if you're by yourself thinking about looking at a brief and really practicing being like, what is the one sentence sort of summation of what this is, and how is that absurd? Like, what would an alien think if they saw this? Is often quite a funny way to get to like, this is a weird world we live in. For example, every time I touch a smartphone, I'm like, I'm literally tapping on glass. If someone could see me and didn't know what a phone was, they would think I was mad. So I think that sort of getting that perspective on things is useful, because it sets you up to find the funny. And then I think in terms of feeling confident about it, it is going to be scary for anyone, even a professional comedian, to be like, tell this funny joke to the CEO of Mars, or tell this funny joke to the entire British public that's going on TV. But I think thinking about it more like having a conversation with someone and pointing out the funniness, in a situation, and thinking of it as being something you're saying down the pub or to your friends on WhatsApp, allows you the space to find the thing that is sort of going to be humorous. And then once you know that, you can have the confidence to deliver it with kind of conviction. And I think that then you have the content and the confidence, so to speak.
Great stuff. Well, we're kind of out of time now, which is a massive shame. Thanks to everybody who sent the questions. Sorry that we couldn't rattle through them all. We really would love to stay here, but thanks to our panelists. Thanks for just sharing all that great stuff. And there's a lot for people to take away in the audience there. So thank you so much for giving your time. And I'm just going to hand back over to Marie at D&AD, and see you all soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Craig. And yes, just to echo those thoughts, that was just such an interesting discussion. So thank you, everybody, Craig, for sharing that discussion, all the panelists today. It was an absolute delight to listen to. So thank you so much.